the Nonprofit Report, your weekly update on nonprofit organizations, issues, and leaders. I'm your host, Mark Oppenheim. Today, we will talk about serving the LGBTQ plus community with guests. David Heitstuman, CEO of the Sacramento LGBT Community Center. Nate Rhoton, Executive Director of 1 in 10 in Phoenix. And Jorge Valencia, CEO of the Point Foundation in Los Angeles. A reminder to Zoom attendees that we will take 3 snap polls during the show. We'll announce results, and questions submitted through the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen will be included in our discussion. So thank you all for joining us. Nate, you're still on mute, but we want to, of course, hear your voice. So we've all come a long way for LGBTQ plus rights, recognition, and acceptance, but we have a long way to go. So let's go around the room and could we have your take on the state of LGBTQ rights and acceptance? Let's start with you, David.
Thanks, Mark. Thank you very much for having me. So the state of the LGBTQ community right now, that in California, a lot of folks tend to think that it's all rainbows and unicorns out here, that we have a lot of LGBT rights and privileges in California. But the reality is that while we do have a lot of legal equality, there is a severe lack of equity within our community, particularly for folks in communities of color and those who have disabilities or other marginalizations that make it really difficult for them to sort of just go to school and access affirming healthcare or be treated well by law enforcement officers. And so there's a great distance between legal equality and true equity and the experience of LGBTQ people living in California and Sacramento in particular. And so we have quite a bit of distance to close there.
It's such a great point, this whole idea of stacked inequality, that inequality stacks on inequality, disparity stacks on disparity. Nate, how do you see this from where you sit in Phoenix? You know, you've got a really interesting state in which the center of gravity is in Maricopa County, so Phoenix, Scottsdale, Tucson, and you have this incredible concentration, but you also have different cultures throughout Arizona. How do you see the state of affairs in Arizona and in Maricopa County?
Mark, it's been a really interesting, I would say 24 months. You had the pandemic in there and it makes it even more interesting, but from a political standpoint, because of Arizona's tremendous growth rates, we have seen fairly, I guess I would call them wild swings in our political persuasions here in the state. So formerly a solidly red state, we've elected more Democrat and progressive leaders to statewide office in the last 12 months than historically in the last 40. And it really underscores some of the changing demographics here. We also have seen a change in the makeup, the quote unquote browning of America is happening here in Arizona, I would say first amongst most states. And what that does for me is it makes me really hopeful for Arizona. We continue to here in our state fight for a ban on conversion therapy, for instance, for minors, which has been made illegal in every state around us, including Utah. So that just gives you an example from an LGBTQ perspective of what we're seeing. And then the thing that's really interesting about our community that I think is very special is the intersectionality, where when we have the murder of George Floyd, when we have attacks on other demographics, that for us at 1 in 10, being an LGBTQ youth serving agency, at first appearance, some may think, why would that impact us? But it does, because every single demographic is a part of our community. So if we don't make it part of our fight and our cause, then we are missing supporting a really significant sector of the youth population that we serve.
And George, you're also a youth serving organization. How does this unfold in your neck of the woods over in Los Angeles?
Well, we support, and thank you, Mark, again for including me. We support young people across the nation, and we're actually right in the middle of our scholar selections process. Every year, I would say probably for the last 8 to 10 years, we get over 2,000 applications for probably 20 to 25 spots. It's very competitive. but you hear firsthand what these young people across the country and the world, because we support individuals that are from other countries that will be studying in the United States. So we get a good sense of what's happening. And I couldn't agree more that, what's happened the last few years, and certainly in the last year, has impacted definitely our students of color more than anybody else, I would say, whether it was COVID, what the reckoning that we had as a country and as a world on race. And so, there's still a lot to be done. And it makes me proud that part of our mission, of course, is to include leadership training and to make sure that we select scholars that are studying in every field possible. But there's still a long way to go in many places, and certainly in places across the world.
Could you just describe, George, the programs and the extent of your outreach? Because I think it's enormously interesting. What you're also doing is you're connecting dots amongst people. It's sort of, if you take a look at what we're experiencing in terms of the pandemic, there is this idea that until the pandemic is cured for the world, right, it cannot be cured because there are vectors of transmission here that can affect us all. But there are also vectors of transmission of ignorance, of hate, of disparity. And part of this idea of equipping people with knowledge and education is to basically position them to cure those vectors of transmission of hate and disparity. Talk a little bit about your programs.
Yeah, thank you. We have, of course, our priority here is making sure that young people have access to education and that higher education. And so we support individuals that are in undergraduate and graduate programs. A few years ago, we launched a community college program. We support individuals that are in their final year of community college. Last year, we launched a 2-year community college program. We also give out $1,000 scholarship grants as well, a one-time grant. And earlier this year, we launched, I guess at the end of last year, we started the process and announced a class of our first BIPOC scholarship recipients. And so when you look at COVID and the way it's impacted them and systemic racism in education, we knew we needed to step up and do even more. Very proud of the fact that before our BIPOC program, 71% of our scholars identify as people of color, but we knew we needed to do more. So as an example, our BIPOC scholarship program does not limit the applicant to going full-time to school, because we understand that that in itself is a privilege. And so we support part-time students as well. We do not require a GPA, but rather a commitment to education and proof of enrollment, because in some communities, they don't have access to good education or the educators that are required to even succeed in a 4-year institution. So we're very proud of that. We had some great support from that, from individuals like Katy Perry, so that helped create interest among young people. We had Wells Fargo interested in that as well, and a few other folks that really made that launch possible. And part of the scholarship, every scholarship, includes a level of mentoring or coaching. It includes leadership training as well, because we want to make sure that these young people go back to their communities and really lift them up.
And David, initially, so many of the organizations like you, community centers, were really about safe space, right? Safe space. It was a place where people could go and just sort of be themselves, express themselves, but also feel relaxed in an environment. But your programs have evolved over the years, haven't they? Have you also received the kind of support that George is indicating that he is receiving from community members across Sacramento?
No, there is a lot of support for the LGBTQ community in our community, and certainly throughout California, as we've gained more legal rights and there's been more understanding of the community and engagement and sort of visibility in popular culture. I think that that's less true maybe for the trans community and certainly for some of the other more marginalized parts of the LGBTQ community. But yeah, the center, was founded in 1978 as a place where people could get some direct assistance, but really have a safe place to be and to find community with other folks like themselves. And over time, we have evolved to be an organization whose mission is to create a region where LGBTQ people thrive, where they're not just safe and welcome, but they're really able to find the health and wellness support that they need to be able to advocate for more inclusive policy, public policy in workplaces and schools and medical environments. And then also to still find that community, that safe space, that place where people are affirmed, whether they are young or old, and can find folks like themselves, and really have that sense of shared experience and shared family that they might not have found at home.
And Nate, your way of expressing this really is through your programs. Could you talk a little bit about your programs? And we just completed a survey, very interesting results. We asked what are the greatest needs among members of the LGBTQ plus community, and we found 64% said safe spaces where people can share information. And then we also found specific physical and mental health support, as well as counseling and tactical support in dealing with society's dysfunction surrounding acceptance of LGBTQ plus individuals. How does that kind of those ideas unfold within 1 in 10?
And thank you for that, Mark. One thing I like to bring up, and this is not making light of this topic by any stretch of the imagination, but one thing that we have to remember is one of the top issues facing young LGBTQ youth is very similar to most youth or most teens, and that is probably acne. Now, I mention that because teenage years are difficult. It's really a hard time. And all of those same issues are affecting our youth. But then you add on top of that, you layer in the issues that affect LGBT youth specifically, particularly our trans and BIPOC youth. And it creates a very different scenario where we have to expand our support and our services much greater than maybe some of our straight allied organizations would have to. So 1 in 10, we've opened 10 satellites across the state. We were on track to have 15 by the end of 2020. Obviously, the pandemic put a pause on that as we rolled into virtual programming. But as we looked at our end of year data and survey that we do every year, this year we found that 54% of the youth that we served experienced suicidal ideations, attempts, and self-harm. For me, this is a stat that not only can it not be ignored, but it's as we talk about pandemics that are affecting our country, this is one of them. And so at 1 in 10, like many of our other agencies across this country, we're employing services like our evidence-based intervention model of Sources of Strength and others to really deal with this head on. It's something that we find at 1 in 10 is an absolute necessity for our young people that we serve. In addition, we have a summer camp that operates usually every summer, serving 300 to 500 unduplicated youth a year, ages 11 to 24. This year, in 2020, it had to be virtual. It was still very successful, but you really alter the support and the sense of community that youth are finding with one another when it's in a virtual setting. There's still a lot of magic that happens there, but I'm very excited to get back to in person, where the true magic of 1 in 10 programs is our youth themselves and how they are there to support one another.
You know, again, you're raising this really important point of trauma on top of trauma. I'd also like to remind our viewers, anybody who has any questions, please submit them to the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. We'll try and get to them. But this whole idea of trauma on top of trauma, we're in a traumatic period of time. We also have had this real division in the American society amongst blue state and red state, blue and red, as it were, perspectives. We have the pandemic, we have acne, as you point out, Nate. How do we shift our services to take into account some of the modern challenges that we face? We've talked about the idea of providing additional support for youth of color, and trying to be more appropriate over time. Before the show started, David and I had an interesting discussion about the whole idea of names, right? How do you place, how do you make sure that you're honoring through mention of different groups? David, could you just sort of reprise a little bit the history of the naming of the LGBTQ or the LGBT Center? And let's talk about making sure that we're actually talking openly and recognizing different groups and exploring the sensibilities surrounding this. Talk a little bit about the history of names of your organization.
Sure. The center was originally founded as the Lambda Community Fund and then the Lambda Community Center when we got a space. And at some point in the early 90s, the organization's board changed the name to the Sacramento Gay and Lesbian Center, serving Sacramento's LGBTQ community. And but the reality is that wasn't as inclusive of our entire community, just with gay and lesbian in the name of the organization. And sort of also represents the dominance that maybe those parts of the community had in controlling some of the support structures and organizations in communities across the country. And so over time, the organization, when I first came to the center, we changed the name to the LGBT Center. And the reality, though, is that probably is not as inclusive as it should be either. And so today we talk more about the queer and trans community with sort of more umbrella terms that are inclusive of all of the sexual orientation and gender identity groups. However, the language does evolve over time, and our understanding of these communities and their needs and the ways that they personally identify change over time as well. And so different parts of the country sort of have different initialism, but what we try to do now is to honor everyone's identity for whatever they see it to be, whatever they feel it to be. And so that means that language has to change and our understanding of those sort of subgroups has to change as well.
What do you all think is the most important factor in creating acceptance? We just completed a poll in which we asked what factors have the strongest impact on broad public acceptance of LGBTQ plus equality. And the area that got the most votes was individual members of the LGBTQ plus community being publicly and naturally out, open and transparent about who they are, followed by laws enacted. Nate, how do you see that idea of just being the day when everybody can just be? What do you see as the major driver here?
One of the top questions that I get from people outside of our immediate community is, what is this, quote unquote fad with new pronouns, and what's the importance of that, and why is this happening now? And my response to that, and I think those working in this space would agree, is this is not new. These identities, pronouns, labels, etc., have always been there. It's just that now we have the correct and ever emerging language to coordinate or identify with those communities. And it's allowing people to, rather than select boxes of LGB, to select boxes that really identify with who they are. And our youth every year, again, with our end of year survey data, we as staff at 1 in 10 are further educated about emerging labels and identities that frankly are even new to us. And rather than focus on how many there are or the reason that they are emerging now, I think it's more important to look at the community that is forming around these various labels and pronouns and how that is supporting these folks in becoming the best person that they can be within that community that truly reflects who they are. And the magic of that is palpable both in talking to these youth, but also in the data and the reduction in things like self-harm and the increase in self-esteem and belonging, all things that, again, teens battle with, that we as Americans battle with, that if we can help our young people to be the best that they can be and to not feel alone, that's a game changer.
George, do you see that there is a generational shift, since you deal so often with young people who I'm sure are informing you about their sensibilities? Do you feel that people who are coming up in this society, where there is greater acceptance, there is more relaxed discussion within media environments, and there's a more diverse set of perspectives that are being shared amongst us? Do you find that the younger people are coming to this whole set of issues with different attitudes?
Not at all. I'm kidding. Yes, absolutely. Every year that we get applications, to Nate's point, we're being educated on how people want to be, how they want to be identified, how they identify themselves. And I kid you not, we get together as a board and we go through training every single year to make sure that we're understanding. I found it interesting a number of years ago, because obviously all of us here have our constituents, and part of our constituents are also our donors that we have to deal with, and those don't always match up. When we added Q to LGBT on our website, the number of individuals, donors that came and said, I will not support you, because they found the Q for queer very offensive. They grew up at a time when that was just a horrible thing. I remember that, And once it was explained to one particular donor, they were so happy to understand it and start seeing it more in various organizational uses that they've become an even bigger supporter of the organization. But yes, I do see a difference. I found it interesting that for a generation that didn't like labels, I kept seeing more. And so it does require a lot of, as Nate was saying, creating a space where people can be themselves and educate ourselves along the way on what these terms are. But I find it invigorating. I really do. When I see individuals that are my age or older in a meeting with young people begin by, providing their pronouns, that I never thought would happen, and so that gives people already a level of comfort in a room in that you acknowledge that. So
I think it's interesting that we're constantly educating ourselves, right? As Americans, we're trying to share information. So I'd like to close this, because we're coming to the end of our time. I'd like to close this discussion with a very important and difficult topic. Change needs to happen where change hasn't happened yet, right? There are still a lot of people who have real concerns. Some of it's based in their faith, their religious beliefs and teachings. Some of it's based on traditional outlook. Some of it's based on their own view of the world. How do you interact with people who are not yet there and who are opposers to the idea of LGBTQ plus rights, normalization, the acceptance that every individual on Earth craves? George, could you give a cut at that? Because the fact is that if we're only talking to people who already are there, we're kind of, in a sense, wasting our time. Not entirely, but do you see what I'm saying? How do you deal with that?
Well, I think nothing speaks louder than personal experience. I grew up Mormon. I'm first generation Latino from Texas. So for a lot of people, that's a lot of, strikes against you. And I actually welcome the opportunity. That is something that we are working with our scholars to make sure that they can sit in a space and not feel disrespected, but also make sure that they are listening to what another individual is saying and engage in dialogue as much as possible. It's difficult. There are some people that will at least sit down and be open to a conversation. And there are times when, You just have to walk away and revisit it another time. But I wish I had an answer for that. All I can say is that I think it's very important. And I think trying to find a commonality in the person or people that you're speaking with is a first start. It's a first step.
David, let's go to you, and Nate, you'll take us out. How do you deal with people who really come from a different place and really are not there? How do you see that?
I see it as an opportunity to have a discussion, to talk about our personal experiences, just like George was saying. And the reality is there were a lot more of those people just a few years ago who didn't understand, they'd never heard of this. What is this whole trans business? Why do you need marriage equality? All these different things. And what we've seen in our community and across the country and across the world is that even though we have more visibility in popular culture, and even though we have legal rights in our communities, the cultural change that's necessary takes time, and that takes longer than any law that could be passed. And so, we operate housing programs for LGBTQ youth, and the number one reason that youth experience homelessness and are in that situation is because of the rejection of family and those close in their community where they don't have those supports. We have health and wellness programs that center around sexual health, gender health, and mental health, because in the standard or the sort of traditional health systems, finding a provider that understands the issues and barriers that you experience as an LGBTQ person is extremely difficult, even though there's legal equality, even though insurance carriers are required to provide that coverage and care, even though you can see a television docudrama or medical show that includes LGBTQ characters. The experience of people sort of walking and living in our community or going to school, over 80% of students, LGBTQ students, still experience bullying and harassment, even though there's a lot of sort of support for them and a lot more teachers and school personnel that understand and support those students. So the cultural change that's necessary is sort of an ongoing process. And we need to continue to help increase understanding in any possible way that we can by having as many of those conversations with those in our immediate friends and family circles, but also with broader community, and trying to get folks who don't agree with you or don't understand to sit down and have a conversation about what their experience is and what your experience is, and find ways that we can increase that understanding and acceptance and affirmation of one another.
I think that's so important. The idea of respectful dialogue amongst people who disagree, can't we use a lot more of that, right? And particularly when you're talking with somebody who's anti-Semitic when you're Jewish, or somebody who is racist when you're Black or Latin Hispanic, right? How do you have that dialogue? I think that's so important. We got a question, which I think really sums it up. Who creates the labels, right? And it really does depend on where you're coming from. Does it come from somebody who opposes or somebody who accepts, right? Nate, how do you see engaging in these dialogues, and particularly dialogues around things like labels? Who creates the labels, and how do we define rights and those kinds of issues, Nate?
Well, I couldn't agree more with David. And so we also invest heavily in those types of programs. I think in direct answer to your question there, Mark, is that for those of us that are in our 40s and beyond, we remember the fight for marriage equality, don't ask, don't tell, the AIDS crisis, et cetera. And the answer there was to continue to come out and change hearts and minds with individual stories. And I know here in Arizona, we've been investing in government relations at 1 in 10 for the last 3 years. And the conversations that we're able to have with some of our even most conservative elected officials have been really heartening to me, because you'll be in a meeting with someone, and George, I too grew up Mormon, and many of our elected officials here in Arizona are Mormon or very religiously affiliated, and connecting with them on those values, and then sharing with them these personal stories, and again connecting from those shared values really does change hearts and minds. And that's how we have to continue to go about this, because the more that someone that Americans can identify that they know someone personally that is trans, that is, a close BIPOC friend that they can, they'll never fully understand the struggles, but they can start to change their own perception of what that individual is facing on a daily basis. And that is where we start to change America as a whole.
I think that's such an observant point, Nate, that it starts with dialogue, but it also continues with sharing and empathy, right? You don't have to agree to empathize, right? It really does start with trying to place yourself in somebody else's shoes and hearing, right, George? I mean, that whole idea of younger generations and older generations informing each other, people of different perspectives informing each other and then dealing with each other.
Absolutely.
So thank you all for sharing. This has just been a wonderful discussion of to be continued on a daily basis forever and ever. And thank you all who have attended and contributed questions for asking them. They were just a big help. Everybody stay safe. That's the Nonprofit Report. We'll see you again on Tuesday. And thank you all panelists for sharing your experiences and the experience of your organization. Thank your board members. Thank your staff. And everybody stay safe from COVID, okay? Mask up.